Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to do a ranking of my preference in the Indiana Jones standalone adult novels. Of course, this means not only the 12-volume Bantam series of the 1990s, but also the standalone 2009 Steve Perry novel, Army of the Dead. I thought this would be fun to do now that I've done a video review of each of the novels and read through all the Bantam novels in chronological order, which is something I'd never gotten to do before because I just had one of the books growing up and then would find one or two occasional volumes. But I had to finally sit down and make a concentrated effort to find all 12 because they're long out of print and getting very tricky to find on the used market. So now that I've read all the major indie novels, I thought it'd be fun to do a ranking video. Now, this does not include the German novels written by Wolfgang Holbein. I hope I'm pronouncing that at least somewhat correctly. As far as I know, those have never been officially translated into English. I think there are some fan translation efforts that I'd like to look into, but my German is not so good in terms of reading the original German text. So again, this is limited to just the 13 novels we had here in the U.S. from Bantam and Del Rey, so the Bantam series plus Army of the Dead. So going from the worst to best, we start with number 13, which should be no surprise to anyone who's seen any of my indie review videos or my videos on these books, or anyone who's in the indie fan community who even knows anything about the indie novels. It's pretty much across the board a general consensus that the worst is the particular tenure of the middle author, Martin Caidin, who produced two really boring books that really are not Indiana Jones in spirit or tone at all. And of the two, certainly the worst, and overall the worst Indiana Jones book by far, a quite frankly terrible book. By the horned toads of my ancestors, it's Indiana Jones and the Sky Pirates, dead last. This is by far the worst of the Indiana Jones novels. This is a terrible book. This is not a book I would recommend to anyone unless you really love learning about vintage aviation and cobbling together a vintage aircraft. This is just terrible. It's overlong. We don't even really get introduced to the actual villains of the piece until well over 200 pages in. Indy does not look, sound, or feel like Indy at all. He's working as sort of a secret government agent for reasons. The plot is all over the place. And the worst part is you can actually see this working. You could actually, by the time you finish this book and you realize what the actual plot is supposed to be, you can see what the idea was, and you can actually imagine in your head this plot, if done correctly, and in a version that would actually, fit in the Indiana Jones universe and feel like Indy in tone. You can see what the author was going for, and you can actually imagine this story working. But reading this is a slog. It took me forever to get through this. I had to force myself to finish both the Martin Caidin books, but this is by far the worst of the two and easily the worst Indiana Jones novel. And quite frankly, this is a terrible book. This is just a bad book, period, in terms of all aspects of actual writing. And I know Caidin has a fan base and a good following, and I know that there are somehow people who enjoy the Martin Caidin novels. I'm not one of them, and it really sucks because I can see the good ideas in here, and I do at least give him credit for coming up with the Gail Parker character, who is a really nice love interest character and works well with Indy, but even that doesn't really work because Caidin doesn't do much with the character and then throws her away in the second book, essentially, and Indy is so completely not himself in the Caidin books that it doesn't even feel like an Indy story at all to begin with, so what's the point, even if there are a few interesting ideas or nuggets that could be considered good elements sprinkled in these monotonous slogs of books. But Sky Pirates is easily the worst. It is dead last. It should be no surprise to anyone who's seen my previous videos. I cannot miss an opportunity to poke fun at how bad and how difficult it was to get through the Caidin novels, but Sky Pirates is easily the worst Indiana Jones novel. It is dead last by far, and every other book is a relief to read in comparison. So even though I don't think any of the books are 100% perfect, it is all uphill from here. So of course at number 12, I have The Return of Martin Caidin with Indiana Jones and the White Witch. This basically follows up everything we saw in Sky Pirates, but thankfully it's a better book. There's more plot development that's actually of some interest going on here. Otherwise, it's just more of the same. It's just more palatable because more things happen that the reader might actually kind of sort of care about. It is very much following Sky Pirates because the Gail Parker character returns, but again, the ending just throws her away entirely, which makes the entire point of her being in both books pointless. Finishing this does take a lot of effort. It is a slog to get through, just like Sky Pirates, but at least it's a little bit easier. But if you were ever wondering why the Martin Caidin books are ranked so low, Caidin manages to make the notion of Indiana Jones and dealing with a warrior witch who wields Excalibur and also having some invulnerability powers on a mission of vengeance boring. Let that sink in. Because that's here in White Witch, and Caidin finds ways to make even that concept boring as hell. And then, of course, he manages to cram in more descriptions of vintage aircraft because reasons. So this is here at number 12 because at least it's slightly better than Sky Pirates, but that's not saying much. So, yeah, the Caidin books were always going to be dead last. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone who's seen my previous videos or has even read any of the books or has even heard of them, because usually the first thing you hear is that the Caidin books are terrible, and people are not exaggerating. These are really difficult. You have to force yourself to get through them, and it took me a little bit less time to get through White Witch because at least it's a little bit more energetic and it's just a teensy bit more interesting. But you know, it's just a hair better. But again, Sky Pirates is so bad that most anything will be a relief in comparison. Basically, from this point onwards, from 11 through 1, this is just more in general preference, and some of these I might move around a little bit, but I think it's a pretty solid order. Basically, everything besides the Caidin books are good or have good elements, and people will get something out of them. So I would always tell anyone curious about the Indy books, try some of them. Start with the Max McCoy ones. You'll probably like the Rob McGregor ones. Even Army of the Dead has good stuff in it, and it's an okay read, but just avoid the Caidin ones. So from this point onward, it's much more in order of preference. So at number 11, I do have Army of the Dead. And the reason why it's lower on this list is because this just doesn't really have a lot of Indy spirit, and Indy as a character is really the least interesting character in the book and the most underdeveloped because the author's focus is more on the 3 different villains. And the whole notion of Indiana Jones fighting zombies really does push this more into the supernatural territory, and that's something I'm not a fan of in an Indy story. I think you need the mystical and supernatural, especially at the end, but you don't need to go too far into that territory. So for me, the Indy books that really cross that threshold are the ones that I prefer less and are going to rank lower on this list. I feel the same way when Indy video games get into the supernatural too much. So that's why I've got Army of the Dead here at number 11. It's a solid, okay read, but it's not really memorable outside of the villains. And I read this back in 2009 when it came out and didn't think much of it. And then I read it again this year for the first time since 2009. And then I quickly realized why I didn't remember very much about it and why it didn't leave much of an impact, because this book doesn't leave much of an impact. But it's solid enough. Anybody can pick it up and get a sense of Indy, but you would think the concept of Indy versus zombies would be a slam dunk, and unfortunately this book it's just kind of there. and it doesn't really gel, and it's okay. It's passable. Let's put it that way. So here we have the top 10, and at number 10, again, going into not really enjoying when the author goes way too far into the supernatural. At number 10, I have the absolutely off the deep end, over the top wildness of Indiana Jones and the Interior World, which was the sixth and last of the Rob McGregor novels. Now, in his last book, McGregor did really go into the spiritual and the supernatural. There had been elements in his previous books of this, but never to this degree. And Interior World is just pure 100%. After the sort of opening, Indy basically goes into another world, and it's one crazy event and bit of insanity after another. In this book, Indy is constantly seeing and experiencing things that are not realistic at all. This is the book where Indy is running around the secret interior world with a magical princess and ingesting the magical fish juice to survive, and in a giant labyrinth with snake monsters, and eventually not only meets and fights a troll, but also a dinosaur, and transforms into birds and flies around and goes in and out of the interior world into the real world via magical portals and everything under the sun. But, at least it's not boring. Let's put it that way. So, some people do enjoy Indy going into fantasy territory. I really don't. Reading this book was an experience. This is definitely the wildest of all the Indy novels, and it's like Rob McGregor decided to just go out with a bang and do as much crazy stuff as he could think of in one book. It doesn't exactly make sense either, which is why it's lower on this list as well. Had it been a bit more cohesive, I would be able to stick with it a bit longer, but the elements in McGregor that I was not a fan of, he just goes off the deep end with this book. So if you've seen my review of Interior World, you'll know just how nuts this book is. But again, it's never boring. So this doesn't have the issues of, say, Army of the Dead or the Caidin books. So that's why it's above those. It's still a fascinating read, but it doesn't really scream Indiana Jones to me because it goes way off into fantasy territory. There's a lot of elements that feel much more like At the Earth's Core or pure science fiction fantasy. It's very much, I think, outside of the wheelhouse of Indiana Jones, which is why it ranks much lower for me. Now, for number 9, I did a lot of back and forth. Again, I think once you get past the Caidin novels, it's very much going to be determined on the reader's own individual preference. And I think different readers will gravitate more towards certain authors, whether you like Rob McGregor style more or Max McCoy style, or if you like what Steve Perry did in Army of the Dead. So I kind of went back and forth on these. But for number 9, I have a book that I actually enjoyed a great deal of, and I think was Rob McGregor managing to grow as an indie writer more than what we saw in his earlier books. But at number 9, I've got Unicorn's Legacy. And the reason why I've got it lower and why I liked it less is because this is where McGregor started to get more into the spiritual and supernatural, and it started feeling less like an Indiana Jones story, and it just felt a bit jarring. This is where he really starts to get into this territory. This was the 5th of his 6 books, and it very much sets the stage for him going completely off the deep end into those elements for Interior World. And this book does link directly to Interior World in some events, and Interior World references back to Unicorn's Legacy, because all the McGregor books are sort of interconnected, but these two are directly connected. So I think it makes sense why I've got them together. This also had, I think, a really great I think the opening and then the sort of third act change were really good. It's just unfortunate this book had, I think, too much of the supernatural. It did have Indy tripping balls and having crazy visions and turning into a bird and various things that don't really feel like they should be in an Indy story. But also it had too much of our characters wandering around the desert, which is the majority of the book. And the best, most fascinating parts are Indy in fascist Italy dealing with a new villain, and it's great. And that's suddenly almost at the end of the book and is over too quickly. And then we go back to the desert again for the finale, which is very short. And then it's just like, why do we have to wander around the desert for 80% of this book? So there's a lot of great ideas here. I think it's better written in some ways than some of McGregor's previous books, but the reason why those I have ranked higher is that I think they feel a little bit more consistent, and they don't feel as much as just our characters wandering around the desert for 80% of the book. And again, anytime you go much more into the supernatural territory and you sort of cross that threshold, I think it's way too much for Indy, who does need to be at least grounded in some reality to make the stories more effective. So when there's more supernatural than there really should be, that's where it really loses effectiveness for me. I also really don't like it when books towards the very end have characters do a complete 180 out of nowhere and change the whole characterization at the drop of a hat, and that also left a really bad taste in my mouth. So at number 8, I have McGregor's second novel, Dance of the Giants. This picks up from his first book, and because all of these are prequels, the first McGregor novels are set in the 1920s and are sort of building the world of his younger Indiana Jones, and the idea is to trace the journey that led up to the Indy of the film, starting in Temple of Doom in the chronology. While this does have some notable improvements over his first book, it also shares a lot of the same problems. His first 2 books take a long while to build their plots because they're mostly about characterization, which McGregor has a great handle on his characterization of Indy and Indy's world, and finding his way as a first a student, and then going out into the world, and then getting his first teaching jobs and encountering people and not really knowing where he fits in the world. Those are the most fascinating parts of the early McGregor books, and there is a loose chronology, so they flow into one another. Here in Dance of the Giants, we do have, at least thankfully, a bit more focus on action, and the book does build to a nice climax setting at Stonehenge, which almost feels like The Wicker Man goes to Stonehenge, and we have a new love interest, Deirdre Campbell, who carries over into the next McGregor book, Seven Veils. But while there are more of the traditional Indy film elements, and this is better written in some ways than the first book, Peril at Delphi, it seems to take forever to actually get to the villain and the actual plot of the book, and it actually manages to feel more underbaked, I think, than the first book. So I actually have this at this point because while it does make a number of nice improvements over Peril at Delphi, and it does at least have a little bit of a faster pace, it just takes forever to get going, and then all of a sudden it's over. And so I don't think it's quite as consistent as Peril at Delphi, which is interesting because Peril at Delphi is a lot slower paced, and because also it's the first book. So I think there's some improvements here in the second book compared to the first one, but I think it overall actually manages to be a little bit weaker than the first book. So at number 7, I do have Peril at Delphi, the first of the Indy Bantam novels and the first of the Rob McGregor series. This is very much what is continued in Dance of the Giants. All the McGregor books have a chronology, so they need to be read in order, and this is our young archaeologist right when he essentially graduates from school and is trying to find his way in the world, and he goes on his first major archaeological dig site, and of course people have it out for him, and it very much is a slower burning story in terms of the plotting. It doesn't necessarily have the Indy adventure flavor of the films because it's all about building Indy's character. And so as a character study, this is great, just as Dance of the Giants is great. But over time, McGregor, I think, transitioned a bit more towards adventure storytelling, and then he went into more of the supernatural in his last 2 books, and then into fantasy especially. So it's an interesting sort of shift, but this, of course, is important for starting off the Bantam novels and the McGregor books, and I think it's exceptionally well grounded, and I like the idea of the setting being Indy's first archaeological dig, and also dealing with an older female archaeologist psychologist who also has a relationship with Indy and very obviously has it out for him, but Indy's not fully formed yet, and he's just trying to navigate his way through this scenario without making the wrong move that's obviously going to get him killed. There's also a very light supernatural element that's alluded to, and it's left up to the reader to take it for themselves just how much of that was actually in play. And I like how McGregor did that. So I really like elements of this book. I do think it is too slowly paced, but it's also more of a character study, and it is the first book, and it is very much a 1920s Indiana Jones prequel. So with all of that in mind, I think it's a nice spot here. And so I think it just manages to be at least a little bit more consistent throughout than Dance of the Giants, which otherwise makes a lot of really substantial improvements over Peril at Delphi. At number 6, I have McGregor's fourth novel, Indiana Jones and the Genesis Deluge. This was basically the point at which the McGregor books were at the sort of crossroads. This is coming after Seven Veils. It's very much an adventure story with Indy and his companions searching for Noah's Ark. It's got a lot of great background detail. There are nice elements that we continue from the first 3 books. There's also a real sense of darkness and grittiness. This is the book where Indy even drops an F-bomb to one of his captors, and there's a couple nice pulpy moments, my favorite being when Indy manages to when they're being chased and he's trying to hold off the villains, he manages to chop off one of the villains' hands in a really nice gory pulpy moment. So there's a lot of grit and darkness in this book. There's quite a bit of anger as well, which I really enjoyed. I liked the grittier feel. I don't think it's necessarily fully Indian tone in terms of the films, just as all the McGregor books are, and I think it does have some of the same continuing issues I have with the other McGregor novels, but I think this is a really solid entry in McGregor's 6 books, and this is really the last book he did before he crossed over into what he did in the last 2 books, really delving more into the supernatural and fantasy elements. So I think this is a nice sort of crossroads. I like the various settings and locales. I like the quest they're on. I just think it could have been a bit more consistent and also a bit better plotted because like the other McGregor books and like a lot of the Bantam books, it takes forever to get to where we're going, and then when we get there, everything with Noah's Ark does unfortunately get saved for the last couple pages, and it feels quite rushed, which is unfortunate. But I did really enjoy this book. It's just outshined, I think, by some of the other books in the series. At number 5, I have the first of the Max McCoy novels, which is Philosopher's Stone. Now, this was a great return to form in terms of coming after the 2 deplorable Martin Caidin novels. McCoy is certainly the author who best understood the tone of the Indiana Jones films, and his 4 novels come the closest to replicating that in print form. They are the best straightforward adventures and the best books for people to start with if they're looking for books like the Indiana Jones films. So coming to this and reading the Bantam novels in order was just like a breath of fresh air. This very much screams Indian tone, humor, action, set pieces. I just think this one is probably the weakest of the McCoy books because it was his first one and he's still figuring out how to write for the character. There are a lot of great moments, but there are some that do feel a bit too much like they're trying to replicate specific elements of the films, which, you know, it's understandable, especially for an author's first try. But also, I wish the plot was a little bit more consistent, and I don't feel we got enough time spent with the villain. Also, this introduces the subplot of Indy and the Crystal Skull, which, of course, is long before there ever was a Crystal Skull film. And this will pop up in the next 2 McCoy books and a little bit in the final one. It's basically a subplot that runs through all his books, and it does, I think, unfortunately, distract from the main plots of some of the later books. But it starts here, and that's the main thread that does interconnect all of these. We also have a nice new love interest for Indy who runs through the first 3 McCoy books as well. So there's a lot of great elements here, and we have Sala and other characters from the films and a spirit of adventure and the flavor of the films. I just think McCoy did better with his other 3 novels, and so this is the point at which I think you really have the cream of the crop in terms terms of really is the final 4 Bantam novels by Max McCoy, but this one is just eclipsed by a few others, I think. At number 4, I have Max McCoy's third Indiana Jones novel, Indiana Jones on the Hollow Earth. This is a really fun adventure. He really nails the action, and the set pieces are fantastic. The globetrotting is here. We have a nice potential love interest for Indy. This book is loaded with fantastic side characters. It is ridiculously entertaining. But my issue is that, unfortunately, it feels a bit episodic. We do have the Crystal Skull and the love interest from Philosopher's Stone return here again. Those arcs are pretty much resolved here, but unfortunately, they feel like subplots to the actual book, and they do feel like a distraction. And we don't get to the overall main quest of the story until quite late in the book. So it does have this very episodic feel to it. It's never bad or boring. It is really well done, but I just wish we got to the quest more quickly and the plot felt more consistent. And honestly, I could have done without the subplots resolving elements from the previous 2 books. I wish they had been sort of done and dusted in their own respective books, because here they do feel like a bit of a distraction, but still, it remains a very good, very enjoyable book that is very much the Indy flavor and tone that is necessary to match what we love from the films. I just think, again, it's slightly eclipsed by the top 3, but that's why it's so high in this list. Now, at number 3, this one might be a little bit of a surprise, and it's also probably because this is the one Indiana Jones book I had growing up. It was the only one of the Bantam novels I ever had as a kid. It's the one I've reread over the years. It's the first one I ever read, and I was very confused as to what was going on and why I'd never heard of any of these materials before or since. But also, I think it's the best of the Rob McGregor novels, even though it shares a lot of the same issues I have with his other books. And that's his third book, Indiana Jones and the Seven Veils. Again, we have some elements of the supernatural and certain elements that might feel a bit too un-Indy-like, but here I think they're done just right. And the final act is fascinating, but unfortunately takes so long to get there that it feels like we're rushing to a conclusion. We do have it picking up directly after Dance of the Giants. We have the Deirdre Campbell character carryover. And of course, this is where, rather infamously among Indy fans, Indy and Deirdre's relationship deepens to a much greater level. So there's a lot of fascinating character development. There's a lot of nice set pieces. There's a lot of great texture. And I love the ideas of the story. I really like the artifacts. I like the quest they're on. It just, unfortunately, doesn't feel as consistent as it could be, and by the time we get to the sort of lost city that they've been on their way to, it's all contained in the last couple pages and does feel a bit rushed. And the ending is very much a cop-out as well, which always does leave a bad taste in the mouth. So this one is the one ranking I have that is a little bit more nostalgic because I have the most experience with this book, and I've reread it many times over the years. So it was just the one Indy book I had, so I would just read it on and off over the years, and occasionally find another Indy book, but this was just the one I knew of. So to this day, when I think of the Indiana Jones novels, the first one I think of is Seven Veils, and while it certainly has its share of issues, I think it's the strongest of the McGregor books, and there is something to be said about how he wrote Indiana Jones as a character, and how his books very much were, well, they were more character studies in a lot of ways than adventure novels, but here we have just enough of the supernatural and the fantastic without it going too terribly far, and I just think there's a lot of interesting concepts. I just wish it was better executed, but the reason why it's so high on this list is that I just love some of the ideas, and it's the one that I've had the longest and have the most experience with. At number 2, I have Max McCoy's final Indy novel, Secret of the Sphinx. This, of all the books, is the most straightforward adventure pulp story. This one you could very easily see done as a film. The tone, the action, the humor, the characters, the side characters, Everything is beautifully done. Unfortunately, it is a bit slimmer of a book at under 200 pages, and unfortunately, I think that does cost the book in terms of some of the texture of the characters and also some time with the villains. So, this is very much a straightforward adventure that starts from the opening beat of action. It is very reminiscent of Temple of Doom in that way, in terms of how Temple is structured, with the opening in Shanghai leading into the main film directly. So this is very much the one indie novel that is a ride of an adventure, and it's fantastic. I just wish there were certain elements that were a bit more developed. But of all the indie books, this is the easiest one to pick up and read and start to finish without any knowledge of the indie books, if you're just looking for something exactly like the films, because this very much could be translated into a film and you could see the film in your head as you're reading it. I just think it's slightly eclipsed by one more particular indie novel that manages to have a little bit more in terms of character development and texture. And so my overall number one Indiana Jones book of all 13 is Max McCoy's Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs. Of course, it's the one that has seemingly the silliest title. This manages to, I think, have all the best elements of what McCoy did. You have the adventure, you have the quest, you have the nice artifact, you have a lot of pulpy elements. This has so much pulpy flavor in it that it will be a great thrill to just pulp adventure fans. And also, this is the book where Indy gets his wild dog buddy Loki. So, of course, I have a special fondness for this book, but I think this manages to have all the great elements from McCoy's other three books without having as many of the negatives. We get on the quest much more quickly. The plot is consistently focused. We get a lot of nice character development. The relationship dynamic with the love interest is a bit differently rendered. It's very reminiscent of Two Mules for Sister Sarah, so it's a different sort of tack for Indy and an Indy story to have that as the relationship dynamic. It's just got a lot of fun, but also it doesn't lose out from being a lot longer like Hollow Earth without focusing on the main plot more quickly, and also has a little bit more texture to it than the much more straight ahead flavor and speed of Secret of the Sphinx. Is it a perfect book? No, I don't think any of the indie books are perfect, but of all of them, I think Dinosaur Eggs is the one that manages to tick off the most boxes and do it with skill and style and really give you the flavor of the films. Again, I think McCoy did that in all four of his books. I think he did that the best of any of the authors, but I think Dinosaur Eggs is the book that most manages to get all the aspects of the appeal of the Indiana Jones story and character across in a single volume. In terms of it has the most percentage across the board. So for me, this just edges out slightly over the other McCoy books, and overall is my favorite of all 13 books. So that is my loose ranking of the 13 English language Indiana Jones novels, the 12 Bantam books, and then the standalone Army of the Dead. This is a very loose ranking, and it is my ranking after completing this read project of finally reading all the other Bantam novels in order and then jumping into Army of the Dead. So the next time I do a reread, it may vary, and honestly, I went back and forth with a lot of these. I always struggle with rankings because I always want to change them 5 minutes later. But overall, I think this reflects my my opinions and thoughts after doing a complete chronological read through of all 13 books. Basically, I think anybody will agree that the Caidin books are always going to be dead last. So it's really just considering the other 11 and which ones you prefer. That's the hard part. So the Caidin books are always going to be dead last, and I knew the McCoy books would pretty much dominate the top of the list. But it was really trying to figure out how to rank the Rob McGregor books and then where to put Army of the Dead in there as well. That was the challenge. And so again, that might fluctuate a little bit the more I think about it, but overall, I really have enjoyed reading all 13 books, and just thought it would be a fun idea to try and rank them. So as always, I hope my babbles about our favorite archaeologists and also Indy in the printed medium have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I know it's very difficult to try and find a lot of these since they're long out of print and very tricky to find, but I think it's very worthwhile and a very fascinating thing for all Indy fans to do if you haven't done it already, even if you wind up not enjoying some of them and struggling through the Martin Caidin books. At least you can commiserate with other Indy fans who have done so. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some copies of the Indiana Jones novels. Keep reading print books, keep cracking the whip, and thank you ever so much for watching.